So at the time of my writing for this video, review codes for Starfield have officially been sent out, and we're really not too far away from the review embargo and the proper release of the game on the 5th of September. And for some reason, Bethesda didn't think that it was prudent to send me a review code, despite having nearly, 400 subscribers. So I'm forced to wait and speculate about the game until release. Though, unfortunately, as you can probably guess if you read the title of this video, I kinda have to admit that I'm a little bit less than hyped for this game, and despite whatever kind of backlash I may get for trying to talk down one of the most hyped games of 2023, which is kinda saying something, I want to discuss that for a bit. I mean, worst case scenario is that Bethesda will successfully prove me wrong, and then I'll get hyped for another game coming out this year, right? So any Bethesda fans out there should get your keyboards warmed up for this video. But yeah, the main reason why I've been less than enthused for Starfield's release is simply due to Bethesda's track record. And I'm not talking about Fallout 76. In fact, I'm going to try and bring up that game as little as possible in this video. No, it's more that I've been looking back at Bethesda's older games in preparation for Starfield's release, and, well, it's kinda had the opposite effect than what I was hoping for. There are just a lot of issues with their games going as far back as Oblivion that I kinda have trouble ignoring in the modern day. Now, I want to be clear about this up front. I'm going to very heavily criticize a lot of elements of these wildly popular games like Skyrim and Fallout 4, but I'm not trying to say that these are like the worst games that have ever been made. Far from it. There are far worse games that have come out this year alone than anything that Bethesda themselves have made. And if you still love these games, then more power to you. But to me, these games have really soured the more time that has gone on. You see, to use a specific game as an example, let's talk about Skyrim. I played tons of Skyrim back in the day. I won't deny that I enjoyed myself at the time. I mean, I sunk like 300 to 400 hours into a single playthrough, so clearly they must have done something right back in the early 2010s. But as time has gone on, Bethesda games just don't feel that special to me anymore. Where I was once willing to sink hundreds of hours into a game like Skyrim or Fallout, now I can't even bring myself to play a new save for more than a few hours. And for me at least, I think that this is due to how the gaming landscape has changed over the last decade or so since games like Skyrim came out. You see, back before 2010, when Bethesda was putting out games like Oblivion and Fallout 3, there just weren't that many companies making these kinds of big open-world RPGs. At best, you might see some sprite-based isometric games like the original Fallouts 1 and 2 before they got bought by Bethesda, but there weren't that many games that are actually like fully 3D that let you explore this big open world in first person. So games like Fallout 3 and Skyrim were mind-blowing at the time. But as we've progressed and the tech has gotten better, and especially the tools that developers are using have gotten so much more sophisticated, it's frankly no longer impressive to make a big open world game anymore. I mean, in the last decade or so since Skyrim has come out, just think of how many great open world games have come to market in that time. Just off the top of my head, there's games like GTA 5 that came out only a couple years after Skyrim. We've gotten games like The Witcher 3, Watch Dogs 2, Breath of the Wild, Horizon Zero Dawn, Outer Wilds, Elden Ring, like the list just goes on. And I mean, Baldur's Gate 3 just came out a month ago. And you might say, well, there's also been a ton of really terrible open world games released since 2010 as well. I mean, most games that Ubisoft put out are massive, big, bloated open worlds that have very little substance to them, and they pump out one of those games like every year, if not more often than that. But I think that this issue only reinforces the point I'm trying to make. You see, as the technology has gotten better and companies are better able to make bigger and more complex games, there's two ways that you can go with that. You either expand in breadth or depth. Some companies have used newer tech to make worlds that are so much deeper and more complex than anything we've seen before, even if their game worlds don't actually end up being that big in the end. But other companies like Ubisoft have used this technology to just make their worlds bigger and bigger and bigger with little regard for the quality of the content that actually fills those games. And I think that the ultimate culmination of this bad design philosophy is, in my opinion, No Man's Sky. No Man's Sky is a game that is vastly bigger than virtually any other game could hope to be. It has trillions and trillions of planets across an absurdly sized galaxy. You could, in theory, play this game for your entire life and still be exploring new planets and new galaxies. And yet, especially at launch, nobody would have actually wanted to do that because this game was the epitome of the phrase, wide as an ocean but deep as a puddle. For most people, it only took a couple hours of exploring before they realized how shallow that universe really was. So many planets were functionally identical with just different paint jobs, and a lot of the various alien species were usually pretty nonsensical and were only really good for a short laugh at how bad they were at best. And it didn't take long to achieve the game's stated goal of getting to the center of the galaxy, which ended up being a fairly shallow reward in the end anyways. But as I'm sure many of you can't wait to point out, No Man's Sky has gotten a lot better over the years since its release, and has gone from a much derided game to something that has actually garnered a real and sizable fan base over the years, thanks to some fairly regular updates to the game. But again, I think this only keeps reinforcing my point, because what do these updates do? They don't add to the size of the galaxy, instead they give players more things to actually do in the game by adding more meaningful content so that the gameplay feels richer and deeper. Essentially, each update helps that initial puddle dig its way down and slowly grow deeper over time so that there's something that actually is interesting to do other than just exploring planets with different paint jobs. Now, when I was chatting about this with some other people before writing this video, one person tried to write off my concerns by claiming that I clearly just didn't like space exploration games. But if we imagine the opposite side of the spectrum from No Man's Sky, we get one of my most favorite games of all time, Outer Wilds. I'll try not to spend too much time on this tangent, since I don't want to spoil anything about this great game, but needless to say, this game is the exact opposite of how a lot of these massively bloated open worlds are designed. There is only a single solar system to explore that has only about a half a dozen planets and other celestial bodies, but every single square inch of every one of these little microscopic planets is meticulously designed to be interesting and fun to explore. Every planet is fun and unique and has its own rules and mechanics, and every location is something interesting that both draws you to explore its depths and rewards you when you get there. Now, why am I talking so much about No Man's Sky and Outer Wilds in a video about Starfield? Well, I know it's mostly just marketing, but so much of the marketing for Starfield has been based around them repeatedly talking about how there's thousands of worlds to explore with unlimited exploration, as if that's any kind of meaningful metric to bring up about your game. I mean, they literally already publicly stated that most of that content is just going to be procedurally generated, so it's completely meaningless to try and brag about it. And like I said, it almost feels pointless to make such claims in the first place when games like No Man's Sky already exist with far higher planet counts. And I mean, we even got another instance of Todd saying his famous line,
"From the rocks at your feet to the mountains in the distance, to the people and creatures that live in these worlds." That isn't just a backdrop. That moon is actually there orbiting the planet. Yes, you can visit it too.
And it's like, Todd, Todd, that doesn't mean anything on its own. The reason why pointing to the distance and talking about how you can go there is supposed to be mind-blowing is because the thing you're pointing at is supposed to be interesting and alluring to the player that draws their attention and makes them want to explore it. The player should look out into the horizon and beyond and think, oh, I want to see what that is up close. But when you just point at some random barren moon that was probably just procedurally generated, it doesn't spark any kind of sense of exploration to me. Like, when I played Breath of the Wild, the first time I looked out over Hyrule, I was super excited about all the possibilities. I was able to see countless cool things that I wanted to investigate and explore for myself because the world was very specifically designed to draw your eye to certain landmarks and give you hints of cool things to come if you choose to explore in that direction. But when I look at a random moon in Starfield, even though it's technically a much vaster distance and we're talking about entire worlds to explore, it just doesn't seem anywhere near as interesting to me. There's no noteworthy landmarks that I can see when I look up at this big gray rock floating in the sky, so there's nothing pulling my wanderlust towards this random moon. It's just a big empty rock floating in space. Not to mention that you have to also take into account the scale of how the player traverses the world, as that affects how big a game feels. For example, again, to use Breath of the Wild, when I look out at Death Mountain, I know that getting to the peak of that volcano is going to be a journey and a half. I mean, you start out miles away from even just the base of the mountain, and then when you actually get there, you've got to worry about things like dealing with the heat and actually physically climbing the damn thing, and you know it's going to be a whole process just to get to that landmark. But when we're talking about a space game where I could just casually zoom out into a menu and then fly from planet to planet in minutes, if not seconds, then how is flying to a moon that I can see supposed to be noteworthy? That's like trying to frame flying that moon as some kind of major feat. It's like trying to frame it like getting to the Temple of Time on the Great Plateau as a major feat right after you leave the Cave of Resurrection. It's literally just right over there. It doesn't take any real time or effort to reach it. The only difference is that at least the Temple of Time is an interesting landmark that makes you want to explore it a little. Anyways, to take a step back from analyzing yet another one of Todd's pointless brags, one of my other main issues with Bethesda games is their lack of focus. As a counterexample, to bring up Outer Wilds again, that game knows exactly what it wants to be and does nothing more than it needs to accomplish that goal. There's no combat or magic or stats and character creation or anything of the sort that gets in the way of its stated objectives because the game knows what it wants to be and is very focused on delivering that specific kind of experience. And the game utilizes every little mechanic that it does have in fun and interesting ways, and it fleshes everything out as much as possible, especially in the DLC, which had the extra challenge of trying to introduce new mechanics without changing anything about how the game works fundamentally. Meanwhile, with Bethesda, they typically try so hard to be the quote-unquote do-anything RPG that they try to do everything, but fail to be great at doing anything. They just lack focus, and as a result, a lot of the aspects of their games end up feeling lackluster because they can't possibly put the same amount of effort into every little thing that they're trying to do, which is why I think that so many of their games tend to have so many random, poorly written characters and quests, or like for every good puzzle you find, there's a dozen poorly copy-paste puzzles, and of course that's not even bringing up the straight-up bugs and exploits that they just don't take into account. And you know, for that matter, we should probably talk about bugs for a hot minute, because famously, Bethesda's games tend to be pretty buggy, especially at launch. I mean, hell, even a decade after launch, they rarely do a lot to deal with a lot of the major technical issues in some of their games. Though, as of late, presumably in defense of Starfield's upcoming release, I have seen a lot of people coming out of the woodwork to point out that a lot of the bugs in a lot of Bethesda games are being vastly overblown. I mean, a lot of the memes and whatnot are making it seem like games like Skyrim and Fallout 4 were practically unplayable at launch, when in reality it was nowhere near that bad. Because, and they're right. I think that a lot of people are looking at their most recent release, like Fallout 76, and how that was absolutely a complete dumpster fire at launch, and are sort of backporting those memories over the memories of their other games and inflating how buggy they were. I mean, Bethesda can have some technical issues, but their games are nowhere near as bad as something like, say, Cyberpunk was at launch. And I have at least some hope for Starfield, since it looks like they delayed the game for nearly a full year just to focus on polish, with Microsoft's help on top of that. However, my biggest issue with Bethesda's games in this regard has a lot less to do with the technical bugs and more to do with the mechanical exploits in their games. And I think that when a lot of people talk about Bethesda's games being buggy, I think they're usually more referring to how many bad exploits there are in their games. Like, yeah, technically an exploit is not a bug, but just like I was saying earlier, it's emblematic of their poor design philosophy. They're so focused on trying to make emergent gameplay and letting the player do anything that they tend to fail to realize how a lot of their emergent behaviors can instead ruin the gameplay and don't really do anything of note to try and stop them if they even take them into account in the first place. I mean, Skyrim was chock full of examples that I'm sure you've heard of before, and chances are you found most of these yourself. You know the ones I'm talking about. Things like putting a bucket on a shopkeep's head so that you can steal everything out from under their nose. Forging jewelry because it's expensive to rapidly level up your ability to make a sword somehow. Making potions that, when drunk, make you better at making potions so that you can make a potion that makes you even better at making potions, repeated virtually infinitely. Putting some weight on your keyboard to have your character crouch walk against a wall while you go to bed in order to farm stealth to 100 with virtually zero effort. Like, there are countless more examples that I'm sure people discovered on their own, and this is just what I remember off the top of my head a decade after the fact. So even though that there are tons of rumors coming out of the woodworks talking about how Starfield is Bethesda's least buggy game to date, I'm still skeptical of the game's quality due to how often these sorts of exploits sneak through development completely unchecked. Like, yeah, maybe there's no technical bugs in the game, but even if you took out all of the quote-unquote bugs, you'd still have a lot of problems like this that have a dramatic effect on gameplay. And these things matter. I mean, I know a lot of people will just say, well, if you don't like the exploits, just don't use them, but I don't think that you can put 100% of the blame on the players for abusing the mechanics like this. The concept of dominant strategy exists, which means that most people tend to take the path of least resistance. It's at least still partly, if not mostly, on the developer's fault for allowing such exploits to exist in the first place. And this has a dramatic effect on gameplay. A lot of these exploits, combined with some other aspects of bad design, like, well, the truly awful stealth AI, the terrible level up system, and the absolutely garbage melee combat, ends up leading to the infamous stealth archer archetype that most people end up playing, often without realizing it. It's really one of the great ironies of Skyrim, that it's sold as this game where you could do anything and be anything, but because of the way the game is designed, almost everyone ends up defaulting to the same basic playstyle because it's just so much easier than playing any other way. And, I think that leads to another big point that I have against Bethesda's design philosophies. Like I've been saying, a lot of their games tend to have a very do-anything style of design, but their philosophy also seems to be that they want you to be able to do almost everything in a single playthrough. To use a more recent example that I've been playing way too much of, in Baldur's Gate 3, that game has a lot of points where you are forced to pick between multiple options. Just in Act 1, for example, the main choice that you have to decide between is whether you're going to help the tieflings or help the goblins and attack the druid grove. There's lots of little choices that you make along the way that affect this, like whether you get branded and how you help out a child that's being persecuted for stealing stuff, and so on and so forth. And a lot of these choices can have a dramatic effect on how the story plays out and how the final confrontation between the goblins and the tieflings and the druids plays out. As Larian stated, it's basically impossible to see all of the game's content on a single playthrough, let alone a first playthrough. Pretty much no matter what, you're going to miss out on huge chunks of content, whether because you made a choice that will lock you out of that content, or simply because they were willing to hide away such huge parts of the game. I mean, in my game alone, I missed out on entire multiple companions that I could have potentially recruited, which means that entire storylines and side quests are just not available to me on that particular run, and I won't get to see various interactions that those companions might have had with the companions I do have, and that alone makes for a huge amount of diversity in what everyone's experience with the game is going to be like. Meanwhile, if we look at, say, Fallout 4 to try and get away from using Skyrim as my scapegoat, I was able to easily and casually become the God Emperor Christ figure for basically every single faction in the game. I was able to recruit every possible companion and do basically every major questline to completion, even when you have two diametrically opposed factions, like the Institute and the Railroad. I was still able to join both and complete both sets of quest lines without pissing off either side somehow. The game only finally forces you to make a meaningful choice near the very end when you are arbitrarily forced to pick a side in the big ultimate final battle, but as a result it almost becomes nonsensical that you're forced to make a choice at that point. Like, if by that point in the game I've maxed out my favor with every faction in the area, shouldn't I be able to speak on people's behalf and maybe be able to come to some kind of accord between these people? But no, they wanted to have their big third act climax fight, so it just happens no matter what, and you're forced to pick a side. But it wouldn't have felt as silly if you were actually forced to make meaningful choices earlier on that locked you out of participating in certain factions earlier in the story, so that you are more properly leading up to only having the favor of, say, only one or two of the factions instead of all of them at once. And I mean, I know I wanted to stop using Skyrim as a scapegoat, but I can't not bring up how trivial it is to learn all the secrets and become the leader of the companions, and also become the leader of the Thieves Guild, and also become the Archmage of the College of Winterhold, and also become the leader of the Assassin. Like, it's so absurd how trivial it is for virtually any kind of character to somehow lead every single faction in almost every one of their games. But, I mean, that's usually how it goes in these games. There are some instances where they let you make a meaningful choice, like that quest where you find out people have been torturing their psychic alien grandpa or something in Fallout 4, and you can choose to kill or free him. But the way they usually get away with that is they save those choices for the very end of the quest, so that at most it just changes maybe what kind of boss you have to fight, and then once the quest is over, it usually rarely changes much about the world as a whole, and then barely comes up again afterwards, so that it doesn't interfere with anything else you might be doing, so that you don't get locked out of any other content. Like, as a result of this, like, after I beat Skyrim, I was immediately kind of wanted to play a different playthrough and try doing some other things, but when I did that, I realized that I didn't really feel a need to replay Bethesda's games, at least not so immediately, because why would I go back and do another playthrough when I've already done pretty much everything on a single playthrough? Like, is it really worth spending all that time doing all the same things over again just so that I can choose to side with the Nords or the vampires instead this time? Like, it just doesn't feel that worthwhile to me due to how few meaningful choices that you end up making in those games. Not to mention that a lot of these kinds of choices usually just boil down to things like, oh, do you feel like being obviously and pointlessly evil today? Yes or no? So, yeah, I think I've rambled on about this for more than long enough, but there is one more important thing that I need to say before I end this video. And that is that I want this video to age incredibly poorly. I want people to come back and watch this video after Starfield has come out to laugh at how stupid I was for ever doubting that Bethesda would make a great game. Like, I never want a game to be bad. Obviously, I wish that every game could be the best game that it could be, and even though my plate is absolutely stuffed with all the great games that we've been getting this year, I would gladly take another helping if Starfield could join the podium of amazing games to come out in 2023. And despite how negative I've been for this entire video, I will admit there are some moments in Bethesda games that are legitimately great. Every once in a while, amongst the mediocrity, you get a quest or maybe even a companion that has some actually good writing and thoughtfulness put behind it. I mean, I was nearly brought to tears when I found that one quest in Fallout 4 that actually required me to make a real skill check. But seriously, I just can't help but be skeptical of Bethesda's abilities when I look back at their past efforts as a whole, and I just don't know if they could really make such a dramatic improvement to their game design philosophies when they've already had every opportunity to do so over the past decade and a half. Why would things change now when these criticisms were already being levied at them, and they could have been changed for the better in Fallout 4 or Skyrim, or potentially even better than that? Anyways, like, I know I always say that I want to hear your thoughts in the comments, but it's especially true for this video. I want to be proven wrong. I want this video to age poorly. I want to see someone write that 2,000-word essay in the comments about how dumb I am for ever doubting that Starfield could be anything less than an 11 out of 10, and I want to see that person turn out to be right come September 5th. I mean, I'm still probably going to download and play Starfield myself when it comes out, so I hope it's good. And hey, if you subscribe to me, maybe you can watch me eat my words in a few weeks after I've finally gotten the chance to play the game for myself. But with that, I guess I'll have to just end this video for now, and I'll see you guys later when Starfield is finally in our hands.